The Vietnam War, the basics. The Vietnam War was part of the Cold War, the conflict between the two great ideologies of the later 20th century, communism and capitalism. It follows on historically from the Chinese Revolution, the Korean War, and the Cuban Revolution, where communism had seemed to be very successful. America feared the spread of communism to South Vietnam, and this lies really at the heart of the reasons why America became involved. But it's important to understand the roots of American involvement. Vietnam was one part of a French colony before the Second World War called Indochina, which today would consist of the countries Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. During World War II, the Japanese had taken control. But in stage 2 of this diagram, we see that the French faced a communist rebellion after they tried to retake control following the defeat of the Japanese in 1945. The Indochinese Communist Party organised an independence movement against the French. And in stage 3, despite the fact that the Americans helped the French, they were ousted from Vietnam at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the communists gained independence for Indochina. Indochina itself was divided into 3 countries, Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. Vietnam, as we'll see in a second, was divided into 2 countries, making North and South Vietnam. In 1954, the French agreed to this, and in 1955 they finally left. The Americans stepped in to fill the vacuum left by the French in South Vietnam, and their involvement in the area grew slowly. Vietnam itself was divided by the Geneva Accords, which were signed by the countries involved in the area, including China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, United States, France and Great Britain. And it was divided along the 17th parallel, which you can see on this map as the thin green line. The north was ruled by the communists. The south was ruled by a democratic government supported by the Americans. The United States got involved because they had a firm belief in the domino theory. The idea being that if one nation fell under communist control, nearby nations would also fall. Recently they'd settled for a stalemate in Korea. They hadn't been able to defeat the communists there. China had become communist in 1949. Much of Europe had become communist in the years immediately following the Second World War. And the Americans feared, as you can see from this diagram, that if they didn't say stop Vietnam from becoming communist, they wouldn't be able to stop Laos or Cambodia or Thailand or Burma or India or any of the other countries in the area, and it was a genuine fear for the Americans. Vietnam was divided then, as I said, into 2 areas, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was supposedly democratic, but was in effect a dictatorship. Led by Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese opposed the South Vietnamese led by President Diem. The North Vietnamese had a lot of support from the peasants, who made up the majority of the Vietnamese people. South Vietnam had very little support. As we'll see in a second, monks set themselves on fire in protest. The generals plotted the overthrow of President Diem. Very little support. The Soviet Union and China, both powerful communist countries, supported the North, and the United States felt it had no choice but to support South Vietnam. Diem was a Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. His government was very repressive and he was opposed by many, including this monk. It's a very famous picture of the Vietnam War era, and it shows a Buddhist monk in a self-immolation, which means setting himself on fire as a protest against what the government is doing. In 1964, the United States President, really, most people suggest, was looking for an excuse to become more involved in the Vietnam War. One of the United States ships, the USS Maddox, was allegedly attacked by the North Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This allowed President Johnson to send combat troops to Vietnam for the first time. And here we can see the consequences of that. The Americans sent, in March 1965, they had 3,500 Marines sent to Vietnam. In April 1965, there were 60,000 troops sent to Vietnam. In July 1965, there were 125,000 troops there, doubled inside a few months. And by 1967, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. They faced an enemy called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, that's hit-and-run ambushes, booby traps, landmines, and they had a huge, elaborate tunnel network which included underground fuel tanks, places to live, hospitals, supply warehouses. They were a difficult enemy to find and to fight. The Americans saw this as a war of attrition. They saw it as a war of wearing down the enemy, constantly bombarding them with ton after ton after ton of bombs, which led to high body counts on both sides. They used search and destroy missions where they would fly into an area, find a village that they thought the Viet Cong may be in, and then they would destroy that village. They used defoliants such as Agent Orange, which would destroy the jungle, such as napalm, which would burn the jungle, and tried to remove all the cover that they could. They spent some time battling for hearts and minds, trying to convince the people that America was there to help, but they never really managed it. Now, the My Lai massacre is one of your key areas for your controlled assessment this year. It took place in March of 1968, following on or part of something called the Tet Offensive, which we will study in a later presentation. The village of My Lai was known to support the Viet Cong, and in March of 1968, about 500 civilians were killed by United States soldiers. We don't know how many were exactly killed. There was no record kept, but the most common figure is 504. They were murdered by US soldiers. Some of them were carved with a C for Charlie Company, which is the group of soldiers who took part in the massacre. Only one man was convicted of the killings, Lieutenant William Kelly, who was convicted of the killings, was sentenced to imprisonment and spent 3.5 years in prison. It was sort of stopped and brought to light by a helicopter gunner from a different unit. It was a very, very, very important turning point in the war. And what you have to consider is what was the impact of the My Lai massacre. Here we see some of the figures. We know that 50 babies under the age of 3 were killed. We know that nearly 70 between the ages of 4 and 7 were killed, and we know that 27 people who were 70 or older were killed. These were men, women, and obviously children who were massacred because they were supposedly supporting and aiding the Viet Cong.